The rain fell in a steady light drizzle, soaking everything it touched. The industrial district at the edge of town seemed like a forgotten corner of the world, where the rusted skeletons of abandoned buildings leaned against one another like weary old men. The streets were covered with discarded metal, piles of trash and broken glass, a place where life had long since stopped thriving. The sky above hung heavy and grey, casting a gloomy pall over everything. In the midst of the decay, a solitary figure moved slowly through the puddles and mud. He was older now, his once strong body bent and worn. His name was George, and though he walked with the aid of a cane, there was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. His limp was the result of a past injury, an accident that had taken away his ability to work in the factory that once provided for him. That injury had cost him his career, his family, and in many ways his sense of self. But it hadn't stolen his heart. George was a janitor, a role that seemed far beneath the man he once was, yet he did it with care and pride. He kept the abandoned industrial buildings as clean as he could, sweeping away the dust, clearing the trash, and maintaining a semblance of order in the chaos. It wasn't much, but it was his, and it kept him going. As he walked toward the back of the factory, his eyes caught sight of something in the shadows near the dumpsters. It was a dog, or rather, it was what was left of a dog. Its fur was patchy, its body emaciated, and its skin was marked with sores. The poor creature was curled up on the wet ground, barely moving, its eyes glazed and unfocused. George's heart clenched as he approached. He had seen many things in his life, cruelty, loss, and suffering, but nothing quite like this. The dog was a pitiful sight, its ribs jutting out from its sides, the faintest trace of a whimper escaping from its throat as the rain soaked through its broken fur. George knelt beside the dog, his heart swelling with an overwhelming compassion. He reached out gently, his hands trembling from the years of pain, and stroked the dog's damp fur. The animal stirred slightly, but made no attempt to flee. It was too weak, too broken to resist. For a moment, the world seemed to pause around George. The sounds of the industrial district faded, and all that remained was the soft rhythm of the rain and the fragile, desperate breaths of the dying dog. As George gently cradled the dog's head in his hands, he could feel the faint tremors running through its body. The poor creature was a mere shadow of what it had once been, and yet in that moment, George felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He couldn't leave it here, not like this, not alone. The sound of laughter echoed from behind him, snapping. George out of his thoughts. A group of young factory workers had appeared at the edge of the alley, their crude jokes and laughter cutting through the cold air like a knife. They were a group of men in their 20s, tough, carefree, and far too accustomed to mocking anyone who seemed out of place. "Hey, old man, what's this? You trying to save a rat?" one of them called out with a sneer as the others snickered. Behind him, George ignored them, focusing on the dog. He reached into his worn jacket and gently wrapped it around the dog's fragile body, lifting it as carefully as he could. His hands shook, but his resolve was unshaken. He couldn't let it die here in the cold, wet street. "You know what you should do?" Another worker chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Put it out of its misery. That thing's already dead inside." The group laughed again, but their words stung, even if George refused to show it. The mocking laughter grew louder as they gathered in a circle, their eyes on George, watching him as if he were a spectacle. But George didn't let their cruelty break him. He turned away from them, his mind focused solely on the dog. "I'm taking him home," George muttered quietly, his voice rough but determined. He slowly made his way back toward the small, crumbling apartment where he lived, the dog cradled in his arms. The workers continued to jeer, but he didn't look back. Their words meant nothing to him. The only thing that mattered now was the life he held in his hands. George's apartment was small, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, just far enough from the noise and bustle of the industrial district. It was a place that had once held more warmth, more life, but now it felt empty, save for the shadows of memories that lingered like ghosts. He carefully placed the dog on the worn-out couch, wrapping it in a thick, old blanket. The dog trembled, but didn't resist. Its once vibrant eyes were dull and it let out a soft, pitiful whine. George sat beside it, his hand gently stroking the dog's side. He could feel its ribs beneath the thin fur, each one a reminder of just how much the dog had suffered. The room was quiet, save for the occasional sound of rain tapping against the window. George let out a long, shaky breath as he leaned back in his chair. His gaze drifted to the photograph on the wall, the one that had once been a source of comfort. It was a picture of his family, his wife, his daughter, and himself, all smiling in a moment of happiness before the accident. It had taken everything from him, his job, his strength, his sense of purpose. The injury had left him physically broken, but it was the emotional toll that had been the hardest to bear. His wife couldn't stand the sight of him in constant pain. His daughter, unable to understand why her father was no longer the man he once was, had distanced herself. And so, one by one, they had left. Now George lived alone. His only company, the silence that echoed in the empty apartment. The dog on the couch stirred and George's heart clenched. He spoke softly to the creature, his voice a mixture of sorrow and hope. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered. "I know what it's like to feel like no one cares, but you've got me now." For a moment the dog lifted its head slightly, as if understanding. It nuzzled closer to George, seeking comfort, even though its strength was fading. George smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting for the first time in a long while. "You'll get better," he said, more to himself than to the dog. "We'll get through this together." The following days passed slowly, but in that stillness, something remarkable began to unfold. Max, the dog George had rescued, started to show signs of recovery. At first it was a faint twitch of an ear when George spoke. Then, one morning, Max lifted his head and looked directly at George. His eyes were still clouded with pain, but there was a glimmer of life, a flicker of hope. George, though physically aching, had learned the rhythm of patience over time. After the accident, time had become his closest companion. Now it seemed to stretch between him and Max, binding their lives together in quiet, unspoken ways. Max no longer lay still all day, though he was still too weak to stand. Instead, he would raise his head, following George's every movement with a gaze that spoke volumes. It was as if Max knew that, even in his fragile state, George needed him just as much as he needed the dog. George, too, was beginning to heal. Every time Max made a small, unsteady attempt to lift his body, George felt a surge of hope. The dog was teaching him that strength could still come, even after everything had been lost. For the first time since his injury, George began to make plans. He went to the local market and bought what he could afford: cans of food, a new collar for Max, and a soft dog bed to replace the old blankets Max had been using. The dog didn't react much to these changes, but George noticed the subtle shift in Max's eyes, a faint recognition of kindness, of care. Weeks passed, and Max's health gradually improved. The sores on his body began to heal, and his once sunken eyes grew brighter. Max started walking short distances, though his legs were shaky and his limp was still noticeable. But with each small step, George's heart swelled with pride. He wasn't just nursing a dog back to health, he was healing too. Max had come into his life when George had given up on the possibility of companionship. Now, they had each other. It wasn't just Max's recovery that brought George comfort. It was the quiet companionship, the shared silences in the small apartment. Both had known lost Max, abandoned by those who had once cared for him, and George abandoned by his family and his old life. But in the quiet, they were finding their way forward together. It was a late afternoon when their bond was truly tested. George was cleaning the old factory, as he did every day, while Max sat nearby watching him. The factory was old and fragile, but George had grown used to its weaknesses. Today, however, something felt off. A sharp creak echoed from above, and George froze just as a large chunk of the ceiling began to give way. Before George could react, Max sprang to his feet with surprising strength. The dog barked urgently, warning George just as a heavy beam crashed down where he had been standing. The noise was deafening, and dust filled the air. George stood, breathless, looking down at Max, who was lying by his feet, panting. Max had saved him. Max's eyes were tired but proud. George knelt beside him, overcome with gratitude. His hands shook as he gently petted Max's head. "You saved my life," he whispered, realizing just how deep their bond ran. Max was more than a dog. He was George's protector and reason to keep going. The following days were emotional. George saw Max grow stronger, but nothing compared to the bond they shared in that life-or-death moment. Max hadn't just given George a second chance at life. He had restored his belief that all was not lost. The next day, word of the incident spread through the factory. The workers, once skeptical, now spoke of the event in hushed tones. The young men who had mocked George now looked at him and Max with newfound respect. One afternoon, as George swept the floor in his usual spot, one of the workers, a tall young man with a leather jacket and a rough exterior, approached him. His name was Adam, and he had been one of the first to mock George for saving the dog. "I heard what happened yesterday," Adam said, his voice quieter than usual. "I didn't know the dog had it in him." There was no sarcasm, no derision in his tone, just a simple acknowledgement of something that had changed in his mind. George looked up from his work, pausing for a moment before meeting Adam's gaze. He wasn't angry anymore. In fact, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. People like Adam had spent their lives making judgments, but now there was something different in the air. It was as if they were finally seeing him for who he truly was, not the broken man who had lost everything, but someone who had found a way to keep going. "He's a fighter," George said, his voice steady. "I didn't do anything special. He saved me, that's all." Adam stood there for a moment as though considering the words. Then he nodded slowly, as if coming to terms with the fact that there was more to George and more to Max than he had realized. In the days that followed, the workers began to look at George and Max differently. There were still some who dismissed them, but more and more people started to approach with respect, curiosity, and even gratitude. The factory, which had once been a place of indifference, began to soften, at least in small ways. But it wasn't just the factory workers who noticed the change. As George walked through the neighborhood with Max by his side, he found that people were now stopping to speak with him. The same people who had once ignored him, who had turned away when he passed, by now offered kind words or simple smiles. They would glance at Max, his coat now thickening with health, his steps stronger, his demeanor more confident. There were even a few children who asked if they could pet Max, and George would allow them to, feeling an unexpected joy as the dog, once so weak and abandoned, now stood proudly beside him. One day, as George walked with Max through the industrial district, a thought formed in his mind, one he hadn't dared to entertain in years. He and Max could do more than survive. They could make a difference. The idea struck him as he passed a homeless man with a scruffy dog, both hunched against the cold wind. George watched them for a moment, then turned to Max, whose ears perked up at the sight. The bond between them mirrored the one George shared with Max: mutual dependence and quiet understanding. George had been considering helping others for some time, but now, seeing the homeless man and his dog, the idea became clear. There were people and animals, like him and Max, who needed help and care. "We can do something, Max," George said, a spark of determination in his eyes. "We can make sure no one goes through what we did." Max let out a soft bark, as if to agree, and so George set out to make his idea a reality. He and Max started small, going door to door in their neighborhood to gather donations: dog food, blankets, clothes, and other essentials. With the little money he had, George bought pet supplies to create care packages for those on the streets, both for the people and their dogs. They didn't have much, but they shared what they could. They visited local shelters, bringing supplies and food for the animals, offering comfort in a world that had once been so cold to them. Over time, their project grew. People who had once ignored George now helped him. A local grocery store donated dog food, and some factory workers volunteered their time to help organize events. Slowly, the community came together, not because of grand gestures, but through the steady, simple kindness George and Max showed. It was a quiet evening when George and Max sat together on the same old bench near the factory. The rain had stopped, and the air was cool and crisp. The factory, once a place of solitude and emptiness for George, now seemed to hum with life and purpose. People would pass by, nodding in respect, a small smile on their faces as they noticed the dog by George's side. Max rested his head on George's lap, and for a long time they sat in silence, content in each other's company. The world had changed not in the grandiose way that George had once imagined, but in small, meaningful shifts. He had found a purpose again, and it was all because of a stray dog he had found in the rain. George spoke quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper, but Max seemed to hear every word. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said, his hand resting on Max's fur. "A reason to get up every morning, a reason to keep going." Max looked up at him, his eyes warm and understanding, and for the first time in a long while, George felt at peace. In that moment, George realized something profound. It wasn't just about the dog or his injury, but the simple act of giving, showing up for someone when no one else would. Max had saved him, and in return, they had saved each other. Months passed, and the changes in both were undeniable. The factory, once a place of solitude, now felt like a place of connection. Workers who had mocked him now offered small gestures of kindness. Max, healthier and stronger, became a local hero, his once sunken eyes now gleaming with life. The community began to see them as more than just an old janitor and a stray dog. They had found healing and redemption together, their bond transcending pain, loss, and neglect. One evening, after a successful donation drive, George and Max returned to their modest apartment, now filled with love and understanding. Max's content rested on the couch as George prepared a simple meal. As George sat down, he reflected on their journey from the rainy streets of the industrial district to making a difference together. It was more than he'd ever imagined. Max had become his reason to keep going, a reminder that even in dark times life could surprise you. "I never thought I'd be here," George said softly. Max perked up, tail wagging. George smiled, his eyes welling with emotion. "I thought I'd lost everything, but somehow I have everything right here." Max gave a soft bark as if in agreement. George looked at a photograph of the family he had lost. It was still there, but now he didn't feel bitterness. Instead, he had something new, the love of a dog, a bond of friendship that had transformed their lives. The door creaked open, and a young volunteer from their project arrived with donations. "George," she said, "we got more supplies for the homeless pet project." "Thank you," George said, smiling. As he glanced at Max, the dog lay peacefully on the couch, eyes closed in rest. George felt calm, reflecting on how far they'd come. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a purpose, helping others, continuing the work they had started together. Max, once a broken stray, had found his purpose too. No longer abandoned, he had become a symbol of resilience, the dog who saved lives, including George's. Amour. Evening settled. George and Max sat side by side in their quiet apartment. The warmth of the room and the food George was preparing filled the space with comfort. For the first time in a long time, George felt at peace. He wasn't alone. Max had given him a reason to wake up each day, to keep going. Max's head rested on George's lap, both sharing a silent understanding. In that moment, George knew that it wasn't grand gestures that changed the world. It was the small acts of kindness that had the greatest impact. George had found his second chance, and, in doing so, had given Max his. Together they had healed each other, and together they would continue to change the world one small act of kindness at a time. As days passed, George and Max became more than an old janitor and a stray dog. They were a testament to the power of compassion and redemption. Their kindness rippled through the community, setting everything aglow. The people who had once ignored George now respected him, and the homeless families with pets looked to him for help. Max had become a symbol of resilience, and the neighborhood children who knew his story loved him. George, too, had changed. The sorrow and regret on his face had softened. He had learned that life, no matter how painful, always held the possibility of renewal. In Max, he had found unconditional love. One crisp autumn afternoon, George and Max sat on the same bench where their journey had begun. The sun cast a golden glow over the factory, which now seemed like a symbol of possibility. The laughter of children filled the air, and the soft rustling of leaves signaled a new season, a season of growth. Max lay with his head on George's lap, full of life. George smiled, grateful. "I never thought it would be you, Max, but you've changed my life. You've shown me it's never too late to start over." Max gave a soft, contented bark. George realized that the path to healing wasn't linear. It was made up of small, unexpected moments, like pieces of a puzzle coming together. Max had proven him wrong. Together they had found a new beginning. As the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, George sat quietly, feeling that, with Max by his side, he had everything he could ever ask for. They had each other, and that was the greatest treasure of all. Max looked up one final time, eyes meeting George's with an unspoken promise. And as they sat side by side, watching the world change around them, George felt that together they had found the greatest gift: love.